Good morning and welcome to Live from FM 91, conversation and performance with some of the area's finest musicians and visiting guest artists. I'm your host, Brad Cresswell, and we are having a virtual version of the live show today. We've been doing this for the past few months, welcoming musicians remotely, of course, due to the ongoing pandemic. Today we have two really special guests joining us. That is flutist Sylvan Bona, also pianist Greg Kostraba. Welcome to both of you.
Hey, thank you.
Thank you, Brad.
Sylvan, of course, we know you as the host of Sunday Baroque. We air your program every Sunday at noon here on FM 91. And Greg, you know, you have a big connection here as well. You were at WGTE when I first came here about 10 years ago. In fact, you used to host this very program. So it's great to have the both of you on, kind of like Old Home Week.
It sure is. Wow.
In a sense. Now, the two of you are members of the Sylvan Trio, along with the cellist Josh Airy. Your group has a brand new digital release. It features women composers from the past few centuries, ranging from the 1700s to some composers that are alive today. We're going to sample some of those works this morning. I want to begin with a movement from the first work on your disc. This is a flute sonata by Princess Anna Amalia of Prussia, and listeners are familiar with music by her older brother, Frederick the Great. You know, when he wasn't in his day job as King of Prussia, he was writing great flute music and concertos. But let's talk about Anna Amalia, because it's an interesting story, and she faced a difficult childhood. Can you tell us about her?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to jump in here, Greg. Anna Amalia. So, you know, she and her brother were actually quite close, and their mom nurtured their interest in music, and their father was absolutely dead set against it. And of course, you know, that was at a time when he got to get his way. And in particular, I think he was especially hard on Frederick the Great, who was just Frederick the son at that time.
Yeah.
But, you know, so she was very much a young woman of her time. And, you know, I think it was probably tolerated as an okay pastime. But, you know, once she got to be older, you know, she was pretty serious about music and pretty interested in it. You know, she had a tough life on a lot of different levels. And it's, to me, all the more remarkable that the music that I've heard of hers, there's not much of it, is so sunny and charming and lovely. And, you know, you think, especially when you think about what a difficult time she had growing up at that time, with the kind of pressure she had as a woman and as a princess.
Where does this flute sonata fall, like in her music? Do we know when it was written?
That is a good question. I don't off the top of my head know the year it was written, but I think, you know, most of her musical activities were confined to her early life, you know, so probably teens or early 20s, because I think she kind of got shipped off to a convent at one point.
Yeah.
So I would assume that it was when she was still quite young.
Right. Well, it's great that we have some of her music and that you've recorded it. We're going to hear the third movement. This is the Allegro non troppo movement from the flute sonata in F major, music by Princess Anna Amalia of Prussia, performed by our guest this morning, flutist Sylvan Bona, and pianist Greg Kostraba here on Live from FM 91. That's the third movement, Allegro, from the Flute Sonata in F major by Princess Anna Amalia of Prussia, performed by flutist Suzanne Bona with pianist Greg Kostraba. That is a track from their brand new release called Music for Flute, Cello, and Piano by Women Composers, featuring the Sylvan Trio. You can find that at their website, Sylvan Trio. It's spelled Sylvan, trio.com. Suzanne and Greg, let's talk a little bit about this recording. Can you tell us what was the genesis of this album? Is this all music that you had played before, or did you put it together just for this project?
It had an interesting genesis. We have had the Suite Orientale by Mel Bonis in our repertoire for a number of years now. And there was an opportunity. I was called by some folks in Indianapolis to play music to celebrate an event they were having, and it just happened to fall right about the birthday of Clara Schumann. So I thought, well, we've got the bonus. Why not do some Clara Schumann to celebrate her birthday? And then we'll lead toward, at some point in the future, having some kind of album with this. And then it happened that the Indiana Arts Commission had a grant proposal. I had received one of those already with my other group, the Trio Kelka Shows. So I applied for it with the women composers, and lo and behold, they said, sure, we would love to help fund this project. And they did, and it made the whole thing happen. So as we were looking for what else to put on the album, we found a lovely piece by Amy Beach, and the Clara Schumann, and the Mel Bonis, and then the Flute Sonata by Anna Amalia of Prussia that you just played. So that was going to be the whole album. And then we played the gig in Indianapolis. That was late in 2019. We made the first part of the recording in early 2020, and then the pandemic hit, and then everything stopped. And they pushed the deadline back for the Indiana Arts Commission for me to finish the album and the project, but they didn't push it back until the end of the pandemic. They just said, okay, it has to be by the end of, I think it was August. So we needed to fill that out. We had recorded 2 movements of the Clara Schumann. We had recorded all of the Mel Bonis and all of the Princess Anna Amalia. So what Suzanne and I did to kind of round out the album was to record some music for flute and piano in Cincinnati. Josh wanted to just shelter in place in South Bend, and I knew we needed to finish the project, so we found some of this wonderful music that Suzanne mostly found for flute and piano to round out the album.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you've got a world premiere recording on here, and Suzanne, I think that you helped arrange this by Diane Gokasian Robbie. Can you tell us about that relationship?
Sure. So I have the great fortune to collaborate frequently with a pianist in Massachusetts, Brenda Miller. And Brenda is a personal friend of Diane Robbie's, and we started playing her 5 bagatelles. Brenda and I have performed them a number of times, including in Leipzig at the Mendelssohn House Museum. But I love these pieces, and they're not published. And Diane is just this very lovely, generous, easygoing, wonderful musician. I've spoken with her. We've consulted her, over the years about different things, tempos and different things in these 5 bagatelles. And so we just, they were the first thing that came to my mind when Greg and I had to reconfigure what we were going to play, because, again, they've not been recorded, to my knowledge, and again, they've not been published, and it just seemed like a no-brainer that, she's such a wonderful musician, and these are such interesting, lovely, and very unique pieces. So it was a lot of fun to be able to play, for me, to be able to play them with another fine musician. I've played them, as I said, a number of times with Brenda, and to be able to re-explore them with Greg was a special treat.
Well, let's listen to them. These are 5 bagatelles for flute and piano, music of Diane Gokasian Robbie, performed here by flutist Suzanne Bona with pianist Greg Kostraba on FM 91. That's a world premiere recording from 2 members of the Sylvan Trio. They're my guests this morning, flutist Suzanne Bona, pianist Greg Kostraba. The Five Bagatelles for Flute and Piano, music by Diane Gulkasian-Robbie, part of their new release entitled Music for Flute, Cello, and Piano by Women Composers. I've been talking about you as a flutist, Suzanne, and you as a pianist, Greg, but of course you also have your radio hats, both of you involved very heavily in the radio landscape. And we talked a little bit about the pandemic and getting this album out during the pandemic, but how has it affected what you're doing on the radio front? And maybe we should talk a little bit about, how important radio is right now. One of the oldest mediums that we have is becoming entirely indispensable for many, many people facing the pandemic. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I find it interesting that it is indispensable, but it's not only indispensable as a radio, but on smart speakers and smartphones and every other way that people can reach us.
Yeah.
What I have been talking about on my shifts on the radio is that we're a special place apart from all of the news that's going on. My radio station in Indiana, there's an AM that's news talk. There's an FM, which is classical during the day with Morning Edition, all things considered, kind of like FM 91, except we don't have a noon news program. And we have a jazz stream as well. So on the classical side of things, I start at 8 in the morning right after Morning Edition on 101.3 FM, and it's just a flipping a switch. It's just a totally different thing. And if there's some stress in the morning about all the news that's going on, about what's happening with the pandemic, and we know things are getting a little worse right now, so there's a lot of anxiety on the news side of the house. And then you come to the classical side, and all of a sudden it's an oasis of serenity and joy. So yeah. I've found that it's, you mentioned the word indispensable, and it absolutely is, but it's something that is now even broader in the firmament than just the radio because of all these other ways that we can reach people with this music to help them, see that maybe, they can de-stress a little bit and see that things just aren't necessarily all that bad.
Yeah.
At least you can take a break from it.
Yeah.
Well, Suzanne, your show is definitely an oasis of music as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about your feelings as a radio host during the pandemic?
Sure. And in some ways, everybody is just feeling so disconnected. And so, there's this isolation and the lack of direct human contact. Well, in radio, we sort of have always done this, right? Like each one of us sits alone in a studio in front of a microphone, right? And you can't see the person you're talking to. So we've got a little bit of an edge in that we've kind of always done this. And so I have really tried to think of ways of embracing people that come into the fold because, and just reminding them that, look, although the world outside is not necessarily the way it was before, and there are certainly some things that are, quite different and can be a little scary, here we are, just like we always have been. We're in this little one-on-one, like I'm talking to you and you're listening to me, and, we've got this one-on-one relationship that we've always had. This is not something that's required us to accommodate or do something differently. And so I've tried to really celebrate that. And the other thing that I have started doing, I'm human. And back in March, I was feeling the same kind of, strange feelings that I think a lot of people were feeling. And I thought, you know what? I have a blog on the Sunday Baroque website. And I just thought I'm going to use that because people need a little something extra now. And so every single day, I just started this blog just one day. I said, I'm going to do this. It's called Beautiful Music in Difficult Times. And each day at 10 a.m. Eastern, I drop a I just drop a different link to some kind of a musical performance that I find interesting, compelling, unique, whatever, just something that strikes my fancy. And it's all over the place. And I try to focus on musicians who are a little less well-known, performers who are a little less well-known, and or composers who are a little less well-known. And I try to kind of broaden the repertory a little bit, maybe even broaden the instrumentation that I might not necessarily choose to broadcast on Sunday Baroque, but maybe we can explore it more fully with this, opting in blog post and, tell people a little bit about these musicians. So I've tried to make it an adjunct to the show of just, here's another chance. We already have this relationship and, I'm your friend and you trust me. And here I'm going to tell you about something else that I thought was interesting that maybe you'll like too. So, I'm always seeking ways to connect more with people. And it's really become critical now.
Absolutely. And who knows where we're going down the road in the future.
Yeah.
Let's put in a little plug there. You mentioned the blog. It's at sundaybaroque.org, right?
Yes.
.org?
Yes, it is. And it's also, it posts on our Facebook page as well.
Okay, great.
Thanks.
Well, let's get back to the album. I want to hear a little selection from this Oriental Suite by Mel Bonis that you mentioned earlier. You had played for some time before. Tell us a little bit about her because, Mel is short for Melanie. That was kind of her pen name, her way of taking the pressure off of her being a female composer in her day. She lived during the, early 20th century, last half of the 19th century. Tell us a little bit about her and this Suite Orientale. We're going to hear the second movement, I believe, the Danse d'Almay. Can you tell us about that?
Mel Bonis was, as you mentioned, a woman composer around the turn of the 20th century. She was lauded by folks such as Camille Saint-Saëns and was a contemporary of Debussy and Ravel. And I find her music just captivating and interesting. Harmonically, it's very interesting. The subject matter that she has is very interesting, particularly in this movement you've chosen, the Danse d'Almay. The Almay being courtesans or female entertainers in Egypt of the time. And with the title, the Oriental Suite or Suite Orientale, she was trying to achieve this kind of exotic sound that was really in vogue in the French capital at the time. And she did a really remarkable job with this, I think. What I thought was really great about Mel Bonis is that she kept composing. She had a difficult time. She was kind of forced into a marriage, and then she found someone that she had loved back in high school, and that kind of reinvigorated her as a composer. And she did get some support for that, not necessarily from the general public, which kind of looked down upon women composers at the time, but from a small circle of people that really kind of nourished her and encouraged her to keep composing.
Yeah, I love the stories behind all the composers that you've included on here. Let's listen to it now, the Danse d'Almay. This is from the Suite Orientale by Mel Bonis. We hear flutist Suzanne Bona, pianist Greg Kostraba here on our virtual edition of Live from FM 91. That's a selection from the Oriental Suite by Mel Bonis. We heard the Danse d'Almay, that performed by flutist Suzanne Bona and pianist Greg Kostraba, both of whom have joined me today. They're part of the Sylvan Trio. You can find information about their new album, Music for Flute, Cello, and Piano by Women Composers. You can find that at sylvantrio.com. I've got one more track from the album that I want to go out with, and that is the very last track, music of Judith Lang-Zamont. And maybe you can set that up for us. Tell us a little bit about this piece we're going to hear.
Sure. So Judith Zamont is another one of the living composers on this recording that we've made. She's an American composer. She was born in Tennessee, and I think she is in Arizona now. She apparently was quite a prodigy, really just showed some very exceptional talent, very, very young. And her musical, she's a pianist herself, and her musical style is kind of all over the place, but very tuneful and very pleasing and lovely. And this reflective rag is, it's a ragtime piece, a very slow ragtime piece. That's why it's reflective. And it has a sort of a charm to it. It's a little offbeat, literally and figuratively. And I just, this was another piece that I was introduced to by Brenda Miller, another pianist that I mentioned earlier, who I perform with frequently. She's up in Massachusetts. And I just thought this would be really fun to do with Greg because, Greg and I, have a different kind of symbiotic kind of relationship when we play, and I just thought this would be just a wonderful opportunity to play this with Greg, and I was right. She, as I say, she's a living composer, and it's just, it's got a charm to it again that I think it really demonstrates her unique voice. And I think to me, all of the music on the CD was appealing because each one really does reflect the unique voice of these women. They are not really emulating someone else or, these are not cover tunes of more famous people. These really are their unique voices coming out.
Well, you also have music by Lily Boulanger and Clara Schumann, whom we mentioned earlier, on the disc. It's a wonderful collection. I think the reflective rag, like you say, is a great way to end it, to tie it all together. It is a really charming piece, as you say, so I'm happy we can share all the music on here. Flutist Suzanne Bona, pianist Greg Kostraba, who, along with the cellist Josh Airy, they are the Sylvan Trio. The new release is called Music for Flute, Cello, and Piano by Women Composers. It's from Kickshaw Records, available for digital download from all the usual suspects at Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, etc., etc. You can find information on their website. That's at sylvantrio.com, SYLVAN trio.com. I'm Brad Cresswell. We're going to turn it over to that reflective rag by Judith Zamont. But first, I want to thank both Suzanne Bona and Greg Kostraba. Thank you so much for joining me virtually here on today's edition of Live from FM 91.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brad. It's always great to be back in Toledo, even if it's virtually this time.